Welcome and thanks for joining us for this webinar. We've titled it Uncovering Heritage. My name is Ben Mackey and I lead the project management team here at SJA. Heritage projects or heritage programs can be quite a significant part of some development projects, and we at SJA have learned quite a lot over a number of recent projects in regards to heritage. Today we're partnering with Niche, a leading heritage consultancy, to share some of our joint insights, both from our project management perspective and from their specialist heritage perspective. Before I introduce our panelists, I'll let you know the content piece of this webinar goes for about 20-25 minutes, and we'll have some questions we can respond to questions at the end. There is a Q&A module within the system. If you launch your questions, we will triage them and direct them to the relevant panelists at the end of this session. I would like to introduce Ben Clifton of SJA. He's a senior project manager with us. He's got 15 years plus professional experience and worked across a range of sectors. In addition to his consulting PM time, he's worked in tier 1 contracting, which gives a nice balance of experience. He has worked in all facets of the development life cycle, and he's been leading the charge for SJA on some of our heritage matters. The co-presenter is Jamie Reeves of Niche. Now, Jamie's the managing director and a heritage consultant in that business. In his 22 years and counting for all of us, he's been involved in well over 500 consulting projects. His time is spent contributing at a strategic level to major projects and getting them set at the outset and focusing on the complex regulatory matters that confront these projects. He has a strong focus on establishing long-term relationships with clients and communities going forward. We do have a presentation to go to, and I'll pass to Ben and or Jamie. I think it's probably important, given the context of this presentation, that we ask Jamie just to give us a little bit of an acknowledgement of country. Over to you, Jamie.
Yeah, thanks, Ben, for that kind introduction. So, look, before we do kick off, let's also take a moment to acknowledge and recognise the first and enduring nations of this country. People are joining our webinar from various places. Particularly welcome to any Aboriginal people joining us today. I'm speaking to you from the land of the Burra-McGadigal clan of the Darug Nation, and Ben will be speaking to you from the Gadigal country of the Eora Nation. As Ben indicated earlier, I'm from Niche Environment and Heritage. We're a specialist environmental and heritage consulting firm in New South Wales and Queensland, and we work on a very broad portfolio of biodiversity and heritage projects. So from that point, I'll throw to you, Ben Clifton, to start off with our presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Ben and Jamie, for those introductory words. So as Ben mentioned, SJA are currently delivering several projects that involve archaeology to varying degrees. So the experience at the moment is quite front of mind, and we thought it appropriate to host a webinar. So Jamie and I have put our heads together over the last few weeks, and we've come up with three discrete approaches or topics to cover the subject. So the first topic is program complexity. So Jamie's got the hard task of sort of describing what is a very large and complex body of legislation. We'll distill this process into 4 key stages, and we'll look at the key inputs and the outputs for each of these stages and indicative durations for each stage. We'll step back from that and we'll have a look at how the actual critical path does evolve as you move through the process. The second topic is interface management. So just to sort of mix it up, we've actually, we'll present a typical site plan, and what we'll do is we'll identify all the typical interfacing components. So that might be existing buildings, targeted archaeological features, site remediation, and the future building. So the purpose of sort of visualising these interfaces as a whole, really, we believe is the first step towards being able to schedule the works with some certainty. And the third topic is to look at cost management. So we're going to actually look at the rate of expenditure as the program evolves and have a look at ways to reduce the overall costs. So, and then on closure, we're actually going to summarise the presentation with 3 key tips. So I'll pass to Jamie, who will kick off the first topic.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So when I was on the tools, I was an archaeologist, and so we're well placed today to be talking about archaeological heritage, and in particular, we're going to be talking about material remains that are buried in the ground. Now, New South Wales has two separate pieces of legislation for managing heritage. We have the Heritage Act, which generally looks after what is colloquially called European heritage. And we have the National Parks and Wildlife Act, which looks after all forms of Aboriginal heritage. Now, both these acts are triggered by the assessment and approvals process in the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act. What that means is that your consent authority will be considering both forms of heritage and whether or not individual approvals under those Heritage Acts may be required. Very much worth noting, but both the Heritage Acts have modern, financially significant penalty and enforcement provisions that includes strict liability offences and quite hefty disincentives for not satisfying consent conditions. They establish separate, complicated, multi-stage regulatory approval processes for both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal or European heritage. And as you can see in our chart here, this can mean a quadruple application, approval and compliance process running in series, or if you're lucky, in part in parallel within your project. And that's what we're here to talk about today and to provide some tips for managing. So on that point, it's all well and good having me talk about these things, but we might throw back to Ben to tell us how this looks from your side of a project, Ben.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. So if we just focus on the first stage here, the assessment phase, so really the core objective of this phase is to determine whether there's potential for significant archaeology or not. So the point of difference is that the Aboriginal assessment does have quite an extensive consultation regime with the local Aboriginal community, and that's prescribed in the Act. At the end or the conclusion of this phase, there is of these assessments, that triggers the need for whether or not you need to apply for a Section 140 permit or an AHIP permit. So now where it's quite interesting, if you have a look at the approval pathways, they can differ quite substantially between the two types of archaeology. So if we focus on the top program, we can see that there's a short, sharp test dig, followed by a second Section 140 application, which requires another approval period, which is seeking to advance into salvage. And then the field crew is required to remobilise for a second time and carry out the salvage. Now, on the other hand, the Aboriginal approval pathway differs in that typically you only see the Aboriginal crews mobilised just once. They carry out the test excavation, and on conclusion of that, they then are in a position to apply for an AHIP for harm. So there's two really important observations here, is that the first observation is that the critical path does start in the Section 140 path, and it's not until you actually reach the salvage phase, which is occurring concurrently with the AHIP testing, where the critical path will switch and then it will continue along AHIP. And as you can see, we've indicated the lengthy duration of the AHIP for harm. The second key observation here is that one's intuition might suggest that once you get through the testing phase, and if nothing was discovered, then you may not need to follow through to the salvage phase, but that's far from the truth. What can happen is nothing can be discovered, but you're still obligated to move into salvage and do a very slow and controlled salvage excavation, which can, span the entire site, take many weeks to fulfill. So that's just to give you an idea of the complexity in these approval pathways. And I might actually just pose a couple of questions to you, Jamie. Is it true, or is it common to see the two-stage Section 140 approval? And is it common to see such a lengthy AHIP for harm approval at the back end?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So the Section 140, yes, in most cases, if heritage has been identified as a risk or a concern on your site, then you're most likely to see a two-stage Section 140 process happening, where a testing program will identify the scope and scale of any salvage works that need to be done, and those salvage works will be based on the significance and relative heritage value of what's been discovered during the testing phase. That would be the most common outcome of most Section 140s. For your Aboriginal Heritage Impact Permit, those timeframes are actually, as you pointed out, Ben, they're regulated through the legislation. So they build in a lot of time for consultation with the community. They also build in a lot of time through internal process with the regulator for them going through due diligence with an application, making sure it gets done properly. So those timeframes there are absolutely typical. I would never expect anything less for an AHIP, and certainly wouldn't plan for anything less. You're probably better off planning for more. Yep.
Okay, thank you very much. So we'll move on to the second topic of today's discussion, and that is interface management. So what we're looking at here is a plan of a typical urban site. The red border represents the site boundary, and for the purposes of this example, we have a site with soil contamination that needs to undergo remediation. The grey box represents the current building, which would need to be demolished. The black boxes represent the location of historic buildings, and the green rectangles represent test trenches that are aimed at discovering any surviving features of the historic buildings, footings and the like. So I guess one key thing of importance here is that the 140 and the AHIP permits will typically condition or restrict demolition from progressing to slab only. And at that point, the archaeological directors need to attend site and monitor works from going forward. And they really do then take carriage of the site going forward. We see this as quite a pivotal moment in the program because what it means is you need to consider delivering the initial works under a lump sum pricing mechanism, but have the ability then to switch to a schedule of rates pricing mechanism and align those phases with your procurement strategy. You may utilise separable portions under a contract to help administer. The yellow circles, they represent additional bore holes that are usually required. These are referred to as a gap investigation or additional investigation, and these would further inform the remediation strategy. So we're just highlighting these boreholes because the archaeology directors may challenge or prevent these boreholes from taking place, particularly the one that you can see in such close proximity to the heritage item. And therefore it's important to integrate the environmental objectives with the archaeological objectives early in the planning phase. I'll pass to Jamie, who will sort of talk through the Section 140 and AHIP test excavation regimes.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And indeed, we're going to be in a position where we're going to have other consent conditions through these Section 140 and AHIPs taking precedence over some other matters at this stage of the project. And what we're presenting here is it's a theoretical example, but look, it's a typical urban site scenario in Greater Sydney, in Parramatta, Newcastle, Wollongong, indeed any established larger urban area in New South Wales will confront potentially similar issues. Sites like this will be being worked on as we speak in Goulburn, Port Macquarie, Dubbo, all those types of centres. Now, while our archaeological permits and the investigations are all archaeology, the methods that are used are quite different for Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal heritage because they have inherently different objectives, and we can see the different methods presented in this image here. The Section 140, which is for the European heritage, generally looking for remains of buildings, things like footings, cesspits, other structures, and pretty much anything 220 years through to the present day. For our AHIP, our Aboriginal Heritage Impact Permit, in that case, we're looking for stone artefacts, artefacts which may be made of bone or shell, and usually because of their age, these artefacts are incorporated into ancient sedimentary profiles, which may be anything up to 60,000 years old and will come right through to the present day. In some cases, on some sites, we also look for evidence of what is usually referred to as contact archaeology, which is the shared history of the first interactions between European arrivals in Australia and the original Aboriginal inhabitants. So that's another very important interface that we'll to be aware of when we're conducting these projects. So the methods to achieve these different objectives, well, we can see that quite clearly. For your Section 140, we've got large trenches looking for fairly large features. For our AHIP, we have dispersed squares, which are essentially assessing a pre-building landscape. So looking at that much more ancient, longer period of occupation in the landscape. This brings us nicely to the next point there, which is stratigraphy. And stratigraphy refers to the order and relative position of things. And it's something that people like geologists and archaeologists are very interested in and get quite excited about. So it's often very complicated on urban sites, and it does require very careful excavation and recording to untangle the sequences that are present there. And also the reason for understanding those sequences is that it helps us understand the heritage values that may be present, their significance, and that will also help us satisfy any permit conditions. Another point we've got there, which I'll speak to before handing back to Ben, is academic research. And it's just worth pointing out that unlike other related fields like history, archaeology produces primary data, the artefacts that are recovered from excavations, every single time it's done. And that data often requires additional work to be conducted beyond the excavation. Some examples of what needs to be done: context is incredibly important for every job. So your consultant will be required to do research into other sites, into previous reports and other studies and archives, required to consult with community groups as well. Another example we can think of, which is more like an academic program than a construction program, is the conservation of artefacts. So many artefacts require very specialist conservation post-excavation to preserve them. So that may require a whole small project of its own. And scientific methods like radiocarbon dating of ancient Aboriginal sites, again, also probably feel a lot more like academic research than a construction program, but they are certainly things that are integral to the job of doing heritage to the levels required by our regulation and ethics in New South Wales. So I'll throw it back to you, Ben. Let's not forget, of course, that there's also a new building, which is part of this project. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jamie. And yeah, look, that the point on the academic research, it's quite interesting, because I know in my own experience, it's not immediately apparent that there's that other agenda that needs to play out. And often I've been on sites with directors who make reference to sites in nearby, in close proximity, and the findings that they've found there and how they all relate to one another. And you start to understand that there is a broader research agenda that's going on, and of great value to future students in the industry. So yeah, just to round out this slide, we'll talk to the proposed new building, if you like, as an interface. And I guess this could be one of the most challenging interfaces, really, because if you're actually faced with a scenario where you do need to preserve the historic features because they're discovered to be intact and therefore need to be retained in situ, that does present a real risk that prior design efforts can become abortive. And we all understand that the costs and the efforts that go to, I guess, resolving design schemes that fulfill LEP, DCP requirements. They're fit for purpose. They meet the client's requirements. You feel like you've achieved quite a milestone to get a DA lodged, resolved, only to then learn that the archaeological outcome is that you've got to go back to the drawing board. So I guess just to close out there, Jamie, is it common? For me personally, I haven't actually experienced that, but does this occur common in the market?
Yeah, it certainly does. More common, I think, than is probably appreciated, Ben, and certainly common. You can think about things like linear infrastructure having to be moved, roads, pipelines, all that sort of thing. For the context we're talking about, certainly the redesign of anything which may be happening underground, if there's what archaeologists call in situ conservation required, or retention of something actually on the site, then that could result in you having to move around anything that is also designed under the ground surface.
Okay. Okay, so we'll move on to the third and final topic of today's presentation, and that's to look at the way that the costs evolve over the duration of the project. So again, we'll start with Jamie, who can talk about the benefits of upfront cost effort.
Yeah, thanks, mate. And look, what we're looking at here is really a fairly typical time and expenditure model for any heritage program. I think it's very similar to any construction program as well. And the things to note there are that the highest costs are incurred toward the end of the program. That is when your project is well underway and actually in the ground. It's also the time when unforeseen contingencies, like what we've just been talking about, a highly significant archaeological find, can place the highest risk to your future project program. For example, delays required through the necessity for design or engineering changes. What we're advocating today is a model where effort in the research and planning phase is used to flatten the fieldwork and reporting curve, if you like, or at least be able to use that effort up front to scope and cost and securely manage that later and obviously more expensive phase of fieldwork and reporting. And that also lets us have as little impact or risk to the future program as possible. In this respect, heritage is not much different to other project requirements. Research and planning is essentially design. Our fieldwork and reporting are essentially construction. And as Ben's said to me in the past, lines are cheap, but construction is expensive.
Yeah, that's definitely a mantra that we like to lean on a lot in project management. So yeah, look, I think the importance of this chart is to just acknowledge that just as you see with engineers, building engineers, structural, mech and hydraulic, if you procure good engineers and they can produce leaner design solutions that can save thousands of dollars during construction, but they can still meet minimal legislation requirements and that the building can still be just as fit for purpose. So what I've learned in my experience is that archaeology is really no different. So having good research and assessment up front will inform more insights into how to test, how the test and salvage programs will likely play out, and how you can then deliver them more effectively while meeting minimum legislative requirements. Just if we do focus on the fieldworks here, we would point out that programs are quite intensive undertakings. They can have 10, 20, 30 people on site on a given day, and this can span 4 to 6 to 8 weeks. So they're large crews. They comprise directors, archaeologists, soil scientists, hygienists, plant operators, numerous labourers. So it's quite a big machine that winds up. And I guess what we can provide you with today is just a few ideas of how you can then control these costs. So we would advocate that you need to schedule often and schedule in a lot of detail, and then monitor moment to moment and respond quickly to the discoveries as the program unfolds. Think about how you might size the appropriate plant equipment to service these large crews. Think about paying a premium for larger excavators that can handle spoil, move the spoil around and keep the work fronts up to the large crews. With regards to remediation, if you're on a small site with limited space, you might think about paying a premium rate to have lab results turned around quickly and validated quickly so that you can get contaminated soil off-site. So that really concludes the 3 topics, and now we'll just move to a summary slide. So just to conclude, to successfully manage heritage programs to save time and cost, our first tip is to secure the heritage consultant early. So bring the consultant on early, commence investigation early, and read into their reports and refine and finesse the design dig before lifting any dirt. The second key tip is to fully integrate the heritage archaeology into planning, into project planning. Consider alternate what-if scenarios, schedule a best case, schedule a worst case, and align your procurement strategy to support these scenarios. And for the final tip, I'll pass to you, Jamie.
Yeah, thanks, mate. And I get to end on a bit of a pun, but with another excellent tip. And look, the final tip is to dig deep before commencing your excavation. So really what you want to do there is discover the things you need to know before getting there in the actual dirt. Understand your site, scope and cost your heritage accordingly, and execute the program with certainty. From this point of view, heritage is just like other disciplines at the interface of our surface and subsurface at a job site, like geotechnical excavations. You invest the time and money to understand soil strength and capability, and your foundations can be engineered correctly and costed accordingly. It's like contaminated soil investigations. You can't have a remediation management program without actually understanding what is there and what it costs to remediate and manage. So just like heritage investigations, do the work up front, understand what you will need to do in terms of scope and cost once you're in the ground, and you'll have a lot more certainty around your project.
Rightio. Look, thanks very much, Jamie and Ben. I appreciate your time in the preparation, and also for those online, the attendance to listen in. A couple of quick questions. I do note at the back of the slide there are some contact details for both SJA and Niche, if you've got any project-specific queries that you want to unpack. Just a question to you, Jamie, a quick one. There's been discussion of New South Wales legislation in terms of heritage. Is there a Commonwealth equivalent that we are bound by in our projects?
Yeah, there certainly is, Ben. We may not trip over it all that often, but certainly on pieces of Commonwealth land or other places where the Commonwealth has some authority or interest, or indeed, and that authority or interest includes things on the National Heritage List and the World Heritage List. So in that case, the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act incorporates issues of nationally and world significant heritage, and it will have a assessment regime and program which will run usually in concert with the state program, but certainly that's one to look out for as well, and one your heritage consultant should be well across.
The other question, perhaps to throw to Ben Clifton, conscious of late stage design changes, we do the planning up front. We have a building form with a lift core in a specific location and a driveway to a basement. The design changes, what are the obligations to go back and revisit the approvals?
That's a good question, Ben. Yeah, look, I think there's very good chance that you do need to revisit the original applications that you've put into the Heritage Division, and Jamie might be able to confirm that. But I do, from my experience, I know that we've kept the archaeology team abreast of our design as it evolves. So there was periods during even as early as the research assessment, and then subsequent to that, when they're starting to design the detailed design dig, that you're advising them of your ground floor plane, where your lift pits are. At some point, they've even asked us for a layout of your foundations and the depth of those foundations. So they'll actually be looking at how much fill you're proposing to and to what depth that you're proposing to excavate to fulfill the modern works, and they'll be looking at those layers in relation to, you know, what they believe, what archaeology they believe's there. So look, I would say that you just need to keep them integrated into the building design team's progress as it progresses, and then on their advice, they may need to submit Section 140 variations through to the heritage as the design changes.
Any additional comments, Jamie, in regard to that question?
Oh, look, only to concur with Ben there, Ben. It's really a case of, you know, I guess the size and scale of the changes and whether they're going to have additional heritage impacts, and whether or not, as Ben says, that could be managed with the design team and your heritage consultant, and they'll be in touch with the regulators who are issuing consents as well. So, you know, in a case where you have to move something not very far into an area that's already been impacted, there may be no change. You may be able to get that one through quite easily. If you then have to do something a lot larger that's going to have additional and unforeseen impacts, that would be one where you would need significantly more input from your consultant and also the regulator as well.
Okay, well, look, we will probably stop there. I'd like to thank you again and thank you for the attendees. And any queries, do follow us up. We'd love to assist with project issues. And thank you all. Over and out.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Jamie.